Okay, great. Well, hello and welcome to our peer learning session on landscape prioritization. I see a few more people making their way into the room, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Sarah DiVittorio, and I'm Director of Conservation Connect for the National Forest Foundation. We would love to know who's joining us today, so if you're inclined, please go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat. Today's webinar is the fifth in a series of 12 peer learning sessions that the National Forest Foundation is hosting in partnership with the Forest Service and their collaborative forest landscape restoration program. That acronym is CFLRP. You'll hear me use that a lot today. Today's session will focus on landscape prioritization tools and approaches. Just a quick heads up that Jane Mandala, my colleague with the NFF, is our technical lead for the webinar today. So if you're having any challenges with the Zoom platform, please reach out to Jane through the chat. Want to spend just a couple minutes reviewing our session objectives. What we're hoping to accomplish today is to increase understanding of available landscape prioritization and planning tools or approaches that can support work in large landscapes. We'll hear reflections from practitioners across CFLRP and Wildfire Crisis Strategy Landscapes about their experiences using some of these tools and approaches. And another objective is to bring together communities of practice from CFLR landscapes, as well as Wildfire Crisis Strategy Landscapes and other cross-boundary practitioners. This is our agenda today in terms of timing. So after we provide this welcome and housekeeping, we're going to hear from staff at the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program and the Forest Service's RIT program, Wildfire Risk Reduction Infrastructure team, who will provide some context setting. Next, we'll hear an overview of some of the landscape prioritization tools and approaches that are out there. And then we'll hear, as I mentioned, from several landscapes who are going through or have gone through landscape prioritization efforts. And following those reflections, we'll have time for some discussion and Q&A. So I want to briefly introduce today's speakers from the USDA Forest Service CFLR program. We'll have on Lindsay Buchanan, who is the CFLR group lead. Bryce Esch is also on the call today, or on the webinar today. From the Forest Service RIT team, the Wildfire Risk Reduction and Infrastructure team, we have Rachel Neuenfeld, who serves as engagements and strategic partnerships. From the USDA Forest Service Enterprise program, we have Jessica Haas, who oversees their fire and fuels program for Enterprise. And our landscape speakers include John Reiling with the Southwest Idaho Landscape. John's the project manager for that Wildfire Crisis Strategy Landscape. From the Rio Chama CFLRP, we have Dana Gwynn with the Forest Stewards Guild and Jeremy Marshall with the Forest Service, who serves as the landscape coordinator there. And lastly, with the North Yuba landscape, which is both a CFLRP and a Wildfire Crisis Strategy Landscape, we'll hear from Corinne Francis, who's the North Yuba Wildfire Crisis Strategy Coordinator, and David Fournier, who is with the Tahoe National Forest as Supervisory Natural Resource Manager. Okay, couple little housekeeping things. For those who aren't familiar with the NFF, just wanted to provide a little bit of background about what we do. The National Forest Foundation engages Americans in community-based and national programs that promote the health and public enjoyment of the 193 million acre national forest system. In addition to leading forest conservation and responsible recreation efforts, we also lead and foster collaborative dialogues and stewardship efforts that create shared conservation solutions. We are recording today's session, just as a heads up. We will be using the chat box for question and discussion, so feel free to use that chat box for questions. And want to give you a heads up about a couple of items you'll receive as follow-up, a link to the recording, speaker presentations, and other potential relevant follow-up information. And we'll also send you a follow-up survey for feedback on the webinar itself. So definitely encourage you to fill out that follow-up survey and provide information that we'll use to make this series, as good as we can going forward. Okay. Lastly, before we dive into our speakers, we have a really quick poll for you. So Jane's going to go ahead and share that poll. It's going to ask you about your affiliation with CFLR, Wildfire Crisis Strategy Landscapes. And Lindsay, I'm going to invite Lindsay on to share those results. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Is that poll live?
The poll came up. I'm not seeing the results yet, so folks are probably taking a moment to select their responses.
I'll go ahead and end the poll here in about 5 seconds.
All right, great. So we've got a pretty good mix here. Looks like a fair number of folks who are part of a CFLRP landscape or a wildfire crisis strategy landscape, and many who've got both or neither or other, which is fantastic. We're really excited about bringing the communities of practice together today who are involved in CFLRP and a wildfire crisis strategy. And we know that there's lots of work happening out there at landscape scales that are, beyond the scope of those two programs. So really welcome to everyone.
Great. Well, Lindsay, thanks so much for sharing those results. And I'm actually going to turn it back to you and Rachel to kick us off with some context setting for our webinar today.
Excellent. Thanks, Sarah. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you. All right. So again, my name is Lindsay Buchanan. I'm part of the planning team for these sessions with the Forest Service, and I also serve as the group lead for the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, or CFLRP. So for context, the map that I have on the screen here shows both the 21 current wildfire crisis strategy landscapes. Those are outlined in black. They are all in the West, and our past and present CFLRP landscapes that are in the West. And those are filled in light green there. And this is really just to kind of highlight the scale of some of these landscapes and show you the areas of overlap. I do want to note that CFLRP has had 7 funded projects in the East as well. So these wildfire crisis strategy and CFLRP landscapes that are part of these sister programs are really both seeking to advance work at scale, right? That can help us collectively make progress towards the outcomes that we want to see, that we need to see on the land and in communities. And again, of course, we very much recognize the many efforts that are happening outside of these programs and these landscapes. So great to have folks on representing other places and parts of the country as well. From a CFLRP perspective, we've had 31 landscapes to date. Some were first funded back in 2010, and some have just come online within the last year. So what I'd reflect there is that landscape scale level planning and prioritization are perhaps not new concepts within the program. And we have really seen that thinking, planning, communicating, and prioritizing is really complicated at these scales, right? So it remains an area that practitioners highlight as being challenging. We also know that the tools, frameworks, platforms out there that might be able to help us continue to evolve, certainly since 2010. And so there's a lot to think through in terms of what might best aid a particular effort, a particular landscape's context and needs. So really excited to hear today a bit more about some of those supporting tools and to hear from folks about their experiences and approaches that they're thinking about for their landscapes. Lastly, I do want to acknowledge that some of you perhaps joined in on a session last month on landscape prioritization that was hosted by our colleagues at the Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition and Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network as part of a series that they've put on for Wildfire Crisis Strategy Landscape practitioners. So this session today is really intended to complement that session, which featured a really informative deep dive on the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative and the strategies that they're using there. Some of the themes that emerged were around translating risk identification into treatment strategies, collaborative engagement, durability of this work, needs and limitations with technology, and how to connect with existing efforts. So really looking forward to seeing kind of what there might resonate or what we might explore beyond those themes today. And with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to my colleague, Rachel, from the Wildfire Risk Reduction Infrastructure team. Many thanks.
Hey, Rachel, you're coming in a little quiet, so maybe just a little closer to your mic. Let's try that.
Let me know. I can switch the mic to, it might be the wrong one.
That sounds better. That sounds better.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. So like Lindsay said, my name is Rachel Neuenfeld, and I work on the Wildfire Risk Reduction Infrastructure team, or the RITS, where my focus is engagements and strategic partnerships. So I'm really excited to be here today. You know, as Lindsay mentioned, there is so much going on in this realm of landscape prioritization and planning tools, with discussions, you know, hosted by partners, hosted by agencies, and learning from, you know, years of this work across different initiatives, both CFLRP. Now we've got some learning associated with the Wildfire Crisis Strategy Landscapes, and of course, as Lindsay mentioned, all of these other large landscape initiatives that don't fit neatly into those two buckets, but are still doing such important work. And so, you know, from my perspective, from the perspective of the RIT and the Wildfire Crisis Strategy, we're really excited to more deliberately focus on what we can learn from each other and how we can start to build on these successful approaches in implementing the Wildfire Crisis Strategy. So just a little bit of background and some context for those of you who may not be as familiar. The Wildfire Risk Reduction Infrastructure Team, or the RIT, that I sit on was created by the Chief of the Forest Service in September of 2021. So it was right before the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And the team works to coordinate implementation of the agency's Wildfire Crisis Strategy, which was released in January of 2022. So since then, since January 2022, one of the first steps in implementation of this Wildfire Crisis Strategy was the selection and funding of these large landscapes, now called the Wildfire Crisis Strategy Landscapes, that you can see there outlined in black on the screen. We started with 10 and then added an additional 11 1 year later, but now they're just holistically our 21 landscapes. And these are really based on areas of highest wildfire risk to communities, to critical infrastructure, water resources, and other values. And so as we work to continue implementing these wildfire risk reduction efforts across the landscapes, we're really looking at how do you reduce risk to these values and make the landscapes themselves more resilient to these future disturbances. And again, I really appreciate this map that Lindsay is sharing, because I think it really starts to show how clearly with these two particular programs, Wildfire Crisis Strategy and the CFLRP, there is so much adjacency and overlap in these initiatives. And it's a really good opportunity to start to reflect on what we've learned and what we've accomplished through some of the work over the last 14 years with the CFLRP, and what we're starting to learn and starting to accomplish as the Wildfire Crisis Strategy landscapes continue to move further into implementation. And, you know, I also think it's a really good opportunity at this moment in time for the agency, for Wildfire Crisis Strategy Landscapes, but for more than that, more broadly, to really look at opportunities for growth and learning and where those exist as well. So, you know, as we talk about these planning and prioritization tools, there's really no expectation that there's this silver bullet that can complete the work flawlessly, but hoping that these discussions are really a good stepping stone to looking at this more deliberately, looking at this more holistically, and reflecting as we move forward. So, you know, like I said, we're going to hear about some of these tools and approaches today. Jessica Haas is going to go over some of these technology-focused tools and approaches, and those are extremely important in this work, but also want to highlight that there are so many more approaches, and just finding that right fit for the landscape and implementing it in collaboration with partners has really been where we've started to see the most success. And you'll hear about some of that today, as well as some of those challenges and opportunities. So, like Lindsay said, this is just kind of the beginning of this conversation between these two programs, the Wildfire Crisis Strategy, the CFLRP, although I know that many of you have been working together on these or other large landscape initiatives for a long time. So hope that there's some value and some really good information here. Really excited to hear from our speakers. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Sarah.
Great. Thanks so much, Rachel and Lindsay, for providing that context. Next, I'm very excited to introduce Jessica Haas. Jessica is Executive Officer for Fire and Fuels with the USDA Forest Service Enterprise Program, and I think she has a great presentation for us. So Jessica, over to you.
Hi, thanks everybody. I'm glad that you could all join for today's conversation. We have a great turnout, which I think really speaks to how much emphasis we're seeing around a lot of these tools that are out there. And honestly, there's just way more than I could even talk about today. So I've only got about 10 to 15 minutes to give you guys a quick overview. I'd love to have you ask me some questions at the end of that, and then we'll really dive into a couple of them during our examples from the forest, so in the landscapes. Let me share my screen with you. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, and just let me know when that looks like it's up.
It looks great.
Okay, wonderful. So as was mentioned, I'm an executive officer for the Enterprise Program, which is a special unit within the Forest Service. We work across all of the country, and my team in particular supports quite a few CFLRP landscapes and wildfire crisis landscapes, and doing strategic planning for fuel treatment. So let's just jump right in. I wanted to mention, many of you have received a survey that was sent out by the RIT team in concert with the WO Research and Development Group. And that was really trying to gauge how people are using these different tools that are out on the landscape. And I think one of the most resounding responses that we got across all of those landscapes was that there's so many tools out there that it can be confusing to know which one to use and which one they should be looking for. So I'm going to try to consolidate some of that information for you guys today. Like I said, there's hundreds of options out there, so this is going to be by no means an exhaustive list of everything available to you, but it'll start giving you an idea of where we're going here with the survey results. We're really hoping that we'll be able to create some kind of living document. We're not quite sure exactly how that's going to look yet, but a living document where people can go access the information about the different models and tools that are available to them, how they might use them, how they could obtain them. So that's a work in progress, and this is just the very beginnings of consolidating some of that information for everybody. And I'm really going to focus on two major components here for these models and tools that we'll talk about. One of them is about scale. So at what scale are you asking questions? What scale are you really looking at for answers to? We're oftentimes used to looking at planning from a stand scale, smaller scale, maybe even a mid-level scale at a watershed. But once you get up to these landscapes, which can be over 1 million acres, the processes that are at play on those landscapes are going to be different than what would be important at the stand scale. So we have different tools that you can use to bridge those different scales, and we'll talk about that quite a bit. The other thing that I wanted to bring to light today is, where are you at in your planning process? So if we look at the basic steps of a project life cycle, from initiating the project all the way through to planning, execution, monitoring, and closing, There's different models and tools and information that you can use at each of those steps along the way to help you get through the process. So we'll talk about that a bit today also. But the first thing I wanted to talk about really is, what is a tool? So we hear that word being thrown out there all the time, but really tool can encompass a lot of different things. For example, tool could simply be referring to a data layer, which is, I don't expect you guys to be able to read all of these, but these slides will be able to be provided to you later on, so you can have them for reference. But we could have some data layers. These might be geospatial or tabular information about a process that we're interested in. And then we have models. Those are often referred to as tools. And models are often computer programs that are designed to simulate what might happen in a certain situation. We have dashboards. Dashboards are really ways to visualize all of the data that's out there and help us see it in a more consolidated manner. We have full decision support systems. These are full computer programs and applications that you can use to enhance decision-making capabilities. They oftentimes will have models within them, and they will also be using data and displaying data. So far, it would take all of those other three tools and put it into one system. And then there's also this idea of a framework. And some of the tools that we talk about are actually frameworks, and it's not a model, it's not data, it's a way that you structure your ideas. So it's a concept of how to approach a problem, how to solve a problem. And then finally, we have a process, which is the actual step-by-step detailed methods that you would go through to get your result. And so a lot of the tools that we hear being talked about are actually processes as well. So I'm going to try to show you some examples of these different steps. So commonly used data sources in fuels planning. We use the land fire data sets. Those are critical to all of our fire behavior modeling. FIA plot data can give us a lot of information about biomass and what kinds of treatments we can do on the ground. You'll hear net value change as an output from a process called the quantitative wildfire risk assessment. So that's our risk assessment outputs. We have multiple fire behavior outputs. We have highly valued resources and assets. These are the things we care about out in the landscape, like WUI or structures, or maybe it's a critical infrastructure, wildlife habitat, all of that kind of stuff. We have some other types of data sources from NRM, FSVEG, and various other ones. So again, this is an exhaustive list, but this is some of the common ones that you're going to hear about. And then we have models. These are the things that are going to produce or describe and try to produce data on a certain process. So those would be FlamMap. We have FSPro, FSIM, Forces. I'm not going to go into what each of these models do, because there's so many intricacies in each of these that I could talk about this for 8 hours and we still probably wouldn't get through all of them. But this is just the beginning. Like I said, we have Fire Family Plus, FOFUM. These are a lot of the different models that are out there. Then, of course, we have decision support systems. These are, you've probably heard of WFDIS or IFTDIS, land tenders gaining in popularity, as is Planscape. These are all integrated decision support systems that will have models and data available to view and actually manipulate outputs. Some of the commonly used processes and frameworks, we have quantitative wildfire risk assessment. That's a process that you step through, ideally with your stakeholders. So this is one of the processes where you're bringing all of your stakeholders and members to the table to start looking at the values that you care about and the way that they interact with fire. Risk Monitor is a new framework that's coming out of the Fire Modeling Institute within the research station, using some of the QWRA aspects to look at a pre and post treatment effectiveness for fuel planning. The Washington office is putting out a fuel treatment framework. We can talk about that in a little bit. Fuel treatment effectiveness monitoring, that's a framework that you go out in the field and look at your fuel treatments that have been interacted with wildfire. Various regions have prioritization frameworks. Region 6 has one that's pretty well documented, and you can step through some of that as well. And then we have dashboards. Dashboards are where you're viewing data. You can't go into the dashboards necessarily and start running a model, for example, to get the data out, but the data is already there and consolidated from many different sources, and allows you to interact with that data so you can look at it visually. Some of those would be, a lot of states have wildfire risk assessment portals. We have the risk management assistance dashboard, which hosts a slew of information. The wildfire risk to communities, fuel treatment effectiveness monitoring dashboards. These are all ways to display data. So that's a lot right there, right? I just threw out probably close to 25 different tools that you'll hear being used in that manner, but they're really, they're a bit different. So right now I'm going to try to show you a little bit more of how these different tools differ. And I'm going to start by talking about scale and how we can use different models and different tools at different scales. So I think what we really need to be asking ourselves when we're trying to define which model or which tool we want to use is what process are we trying to define on our landscape? What process are we trying to investigate? What questions do we want to answer? Everything really should revolve around that. I think oftentimes we see people grab a tool and are like, well, what can this tool do for me? Instead of asking the question first and going out and finding the appropriate tool. So it'd be akin to going to your toolbox, grabbing your hammer and saying, what can I hit with this? Rather than saying, I need to put a nail into this board. What tool should I use to do that? So really start asking yourselves what are the questions that you need answered? What do you need help with? Up front, and then you can find the appropriate tool that will help you answer those questions. So these are some of the common processes that we see that span different scales. We oftentimes work at the stand level, so it's easy to start gravitating towards information that tells us how many trees do we have out on the ground, what would happen if this 10-acre plot burned, what would we expect to see for flame lengths on that? But when you start getting up into those landscape scales, what you really want to be looking at is how does fire move across your landscape? For example, if you are trying to do some field treatment work on a forested land and the intent is to protect the community next to it, what you really need to do is look at fire spread and that transmission component, because fire is not going to stay put on your landscape. It's going to move from the forested land over into the WUI or the communities adjacent. And so it's really not about what's happening at that stand scale. It's what's happening at that landscape scale. And I think these are processes that are a little bit harder to quantify, and they can be a little bit harder for us to visualize because you're not able to see 1 million acres all at once, right? So we have these models that can help us really look at those larger processes and what's happening at those bigger landscape level. So if you start from the questions that you're trying to ask, whether it's where do I want to spend my money? Where do I want to put my field treatments? That would be in your strategic planning. Whether you're trying to figure out what's that transmission look like. There are times when you would want to look at your static fire behavior. If I'm a firefighter standing on a potential control location, would it be safe for me to stay there if a fire's coming at me? You may want to be asking questions about how much is this going to cost? How effective would it be if I decided to treat stand A versus stand B? So there's all these different questions that you may be asking on your landscape. And this is our initial attempt at trying to consolidate some of that information where those models fit to answer some of those questions. So we have the process here in black, and then the models are in orange. And then to make things a little bit more confusing as to how these fit together, you have all the dashboards and decision support systems and frameworks that bring in those models and bring in those other pieces of information to help you answer these questions. So I've split these out by what's a model versus what is a different type of tool. And so, for example, IFTDIS, which many of you may have heard of before, takes in the FLAM map model to give you both fire spread and static fire behavior. It's using that model underneath. The QWRA process typically uses the FSIM model to get at that fire spread, but it can also use the FLAM map burn probabilities, which are a part of the IFTDIS platform as well. So all of these are in blue here, like I said, are going to be more of those integrated dashboards, processes, and they're going to be using models. And even though we hear about hundreds of different models or tools out there, there really aren't that many fire behavior models that we're incorporating into all of these different dashboards, all of this different data, all the different decision support systems. There's really only a handful that get used most often. That's FSIM, FS Pro, FLAM Map. Forces is one that you may have heard of before. This is a model that allows you to do a trade-off analysis between different things that you consider to be important, whether it's cost or reducing risk. And that prioritization optimization model is what is the underlying optimization model within land tender and landscapes. So these two are both running Forces. The RMA dashboard is producing a lot of uses a lot of outputs from models. It doesn't model anything in and of itself, but so yeah, I know there's a lot of moving pieces here. That's why I want to leave a little bit of time for questions so that you can ask me how these things all fit together. But before I open it up to questions, I just wanted to bring us back to that project life cycle. So again, a typical project life cycle, you have a project initiation involving your strategic planning. This could be part of developing a purpose and need. You're going to start your stakeholder engagement at this phase. Moving into the planning, which would be our NEPA and compliance planning for federal lands. And then we're going to execute our project, right? And start implementing treatments on the ground. Part of that may be responding to a wildfire that occurs during the middle of your treatment implementation. And then we have monitoring. Part of monitoring is always evaluating your performance. And then finally, at the end of that project life cycle would be closing out and doing final reporting. So some of the tools that you would use, different tools along the way, along the different steps here. So a lot of the ones that you're going to hear about today are really in this initiation phase here, where we're looking at how do we strategically set up our landscape? Where do we identify areas that we'd like to treat? And how much is that going to cost? How can we engage our stakeholders in that process? So you'll hear from a couple different examples of how they've done the strategic planning in this project initiation up here. Some of these tools, though, can still be used during the NEPA process. And one of the important things to consider when you're using any of these tools within NEPA planning is, can you judge a pre-treatment versus a post-treatment? So you want to be able to look at your alternatives, your alternative actions through those. And IFTDIS has been used quite a bit for that. There's some other options that are coming out there as well. FBS has historically been used quite a bit, especially in the silviculture world. It's very hard to, typical FBS is a forest vegetation simulator. It's a growth and yield model. It can get us the effects of what we would expect post-treatment, but it's not at a landscape scale. So you're still missing some of those interactions, that fire spread. What happens in stand A doesn't necessarily interact with stand B. So there are more advanced models that can help you get at those landscape processes. Again, when you're looking at a landscape level, trying to decide these tools, you really want to think about what processes are playing out across those landscapes and at that bigger area. Then we can go into executing and implementation. Again, these are more of our operational tools here. Behave Plus can help us with burn plan writing, for example. WFDIS can help us with our incident response planning. Monitoring and evaluating performance metrics. We have a slew of different ways that we can start looking at monitoring. FTIM is a process that you would go out and look at, visually inspect things that are fuel treatments that have interacted with fire on the ground. So that's one form of monitoring. The risk monitor, which you'll probably be hearing more and more about if you haven't already, is a way to look at a landscape scale risk assessment before treatment and after treatment to see what kind of effect you've had at that larger scale. And finally, we have some data sets and dashboards that we can use that can help in our final reporting and closeout. So I know I kind of went through a lot. I didn't go into detail on any one of these individual frameworks or any one of these individual tools. And that was, like I said, kind of on purpose because there's so many out there. We will be building more information that would give you detailed answers on what exactly each of these tools does, what it can output, whether it's a data layer, whether it's a model. But I thought I would pause there and see if we have any questions and see how we're doing on time.
Yeah, I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but if anybody does have a question, I think we do have a minute or two for some questions. And if you're still formulating your question, then there will also be time after the landscape reflection. But we will pause for a moment and see if any questions come up. Yes, we will. To the question in the chat about sharing links to these resources, we will be sharing the presentation file. Excuse me. We will be sharing the presentation slides, if that's what you're referring to.
Well, I'm not seeing any questions yet, so feel free to write those down. You can always email me as well. I can put my contact information in the chat if you have any of these that you'd specifically like to talk about on your landscape and how they could help you out. I will absolutely be available for that. So thank you very much, and I'll pass it over to our first, or back to Sarah to introduce our next speaker.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. And there is one question there about what about stimulation modeling using state and transition modeling, if you want to speak to that before we move on.
Sure. A lot of the models that I went over today were really fire specific, so not a ton of state and transition models in there. FBS does have a little bit of that in their growth and yield model. And again, I think that the state and transition models are going to really become important when you're trying to figure out how are things going to look in the future. So not necessarily what can I change and impact today, how is that going to regrow? You can use those types of models for really answering questions around how long can I expect a treatment to last. So I'm not sure if the question really is about how to use them, or if you're wondering what are some of the options available for straight state and transition models. Any clarity, David?
Unmute. Is my video on yet? Oh, wow. Sorry. Sorry. Got to push like 5 different buttons in Zoom versus Teams. So yeah, it was just a question of, are folks using them? How would they be used? And I agree this is a futuring thing, but some ways the decisions you make today really depend on what the future effects are going to be, right? So you don't want to make a decision today that's going to lead to deleterious effects in the future. So as well as you might consider potentially other resources as well, besides just the fire effects. What the effects are going to be on the overall ecology and growth of those areas that aren't having the treatment. So.
Yeah, and I think that that would be part of the frameworks that I was talking about, how you're because you're going to be linking a couple different models together to be able to answer some of those questions. State and transition models would be one. So you have a model telling you, where should I treat to reduce risk, for example? And then if I did treat and reduce risk, what impacts are those going to have on the ecosystem moving forward? So we don't have any computational model yet that does a really good job of getting at all of those questions into one model. So you end up having to kind of do a series of models when we're looking at that. So there was an effort to try to put together a large fire simulation model called FSIM with some of the state and transition modeling from FBS, and the intent was it was called LSIM, and I think they've made a lot of progress on being able to do that, but it's not it's still in a research development state. If anybody else is on the call and has heard of any models that does a really good job of integrating those stand dynamics, which is with a large fire spread, please let me know. There's probably some new state of the art out there that I may not have heard of, but Landfire, for example, uses a lot of state and transition modeling to grow their fuels afterwards. So there's a lot of logic baked into our basic data sets that we use for fire behavior modeling to show how things would move forward in the future. So you could use some of that Landfire state and transition models that they have available for use as well to be able to answer those questions after you treat it. You know, if you hypothetically treated your landscape, and how would that look like in the future? I'll be curious to hear if anybody on the call, either now or afterwards, when we have a little bit more time to talk, has been using some integration of those fire spread models with the state and transition model to help answer some of those questions.
Great. Okay, great question. And thanks so much for that presentation, Jessica. Really helped kind of put all those tools in perspective. Next, we're going to hear reflections from speakers representing 3 landscapes that are familiar with landscape prioritization efforts. We've asked each speaker to provide brief reflections covering, for example, what tools or approaches they've used or considered using, some benefits and challenges they've encountered, and also partner engagement and what that has looked like or could look like. We've asked each speaker to keep their remarks to about 7 to 10 minutes, so we have time for a few questions and discussions at the end. So first, I'd like to welcome John Reiling, Project Manager for the Southwest Idaho Wildfire Crisis Strategy Landscape.
Thanks, Sarah. So I've been in the project manager role for the Southwest Idaho landscape for just about a year. And as you might have noticed on Lindsay's slide, we have a WCS landscape and 2 currently unfunded CFLRPs. After our landscape was designated and we developed our action plan, we knew there was a need to standardize how we discuss wildfire risk and what we're doing to address it. We needed something that was a bit more refined than the broad high-risk fireshed assessment that was used to inform the designation of the 21 WCS landscapes. We were really fortunate to have some really smart folks from our regional fire analytics shop, along with the Fire Modeling Institute, to develop a mid-scale wildfire risk analysis and prioritization process. This mid-scale analytical framework, it came from a series of meetings with partners, agency staff, a workshop that we held in McCall, Idaho. It's now known as the Risk Monitor. The Southwest Idaho, or I should say for Southwest Idaho, the Risk Monitor was developed based on a regional QWRA, Quantitative Wildfire Risk Assessment, as well as information from the RMA Risk Management Assistance Dashboard, as well as treatment effectiveness and prioritization process that was developed specific for the Intermountain region. That allowed us to establish a common operating picture for shared values across all jurisdictional ownerships, particularly risk to communities, critical infrastructure, and surface drinking water. The Risk Monitor validated that in most cases, we were in fact prioritizing the right tool in the right location, but it also identified some gaps and highlighted that for us to effectively reduce the risk to communities, our strategy had to employ an all lands approach. On Forest Service ownership, we could do a lot to reduce the chance and timing of exposure to HVRAs, highly valued resources and assets. This was referred to as remote fuels treatments. But most of our opportunities for effective, durable treatments that directly reduce risk to communities or housing is primarily on private ownership. And so we use this information to do two things. First, we discussed it during our internal Forest Service program of work planning and initiated a NEPA planning effort for fuel break CE focused in the area with highest risk to communities. This effort also leveraged the pods work that had previously been completed. And second, we bolstered ongoing cross-boundary efforts that were managed at the time through and still managed through our shared stewardship initiative by establishing an all lands partnership targeting landscape that are targeting a landscape that the risk monitor highlighted as high risk to communities, critical infrastructure, and surface drinking water. And so the map that's shown on the screen is our all lands partnership area, which is a slight expansion from our designated WCS landscape. And we use that risk modeling as well as discussions with partners to inform where that all lands partnership boundary would be. The Southwest Idaho All Lands Partnership was established to add capacity and funding to efforts that were ongoing by Idaho Department of Lands, counties, fire working groups, and place-based collaboratives that were spread across the landscape. Pulling together partners who had specific interest or had already been working in the area allowed the partnership to work within the statewide structure of the Shared Stewardship Initiative while adding value to ongoing place-based efforts. The partnership strategy has been led and facilitated by the National Forest Foundation, and NFF has added positions, coordinated the development of governance documents, and served as an aggregator of funds. And I've got to say, having NFF step up has been huge for us. And the All Lands Partnership effort, quite honestly, wouldn't have been possible without a partner like NFF taking ownership in the effort. The Forest Service just didn't have capacity. It wasn't really within our wheelhouse. And so that's been a huge bonus for the landscape and our risk reduction efforts. This effort has faced numerous challenges. First and foremost, trying something new with a group of already capacity limited resources was not surprisingly met with a lot of skepticism and in some cases outright rejection. And to be honest, we're still in the throes of it, but as we've improved communication and developed some structure to the effort, we've established strong advocates and a lot of momentum. We've had to spend a lot of time evolving based on conversations with partners and clarifying how this effort will be value added and not simply another set of meetings to accomplish the same objectives of ongoing efforts, not just another collaborative group. For example, initially, we thought we'd use risk analytics to inform areas to prioritize where to focus treatments, regardless of whether that overlapped ongoing efforts. We quickly realized the importance of supporting ongoing efforts where there was already landowner buy-in, even if those areas didn't result in the highest return on investment for risk reduction. The model that we've kind of developed around this or the process is that by fostering that trust and working with those local communities, we can then use that momentum to expand into high-risk areas where landowner support is lacking and identify opportunities for multi-jurisdictional projects. Another huge challenge early on was not having a common operating picture. Each agency and organization had their own risk or hazard-based models, some of which they had a lot of ownership in simply due to their investment of time and resources into that tool. And a lot of their planning efforts and prioritization processes were based on that tool. And they all approached risk and they were at different scales and they approached prioritization from different perspectives. And all of them had value. So for example, some of the counties like Boise County, they used IFTDIS, Interagency Fuel Treatment Decision Support System, for their CWPP, Community Wildfire Protection Plan. The state action plan, they had their whole own separate tool that they had developed, as did Idaho Power and the Forest Service and BLM. We were using a suite of tools, many of which Jessica mentioned in her summary. The FSVEG Spatial Data Analyzer is one that I didn't see highlighted, but we were using that for projects as well. The Risk Monitor provided a transparent, science-based, data-driven platform for everyone to get on the same page, and at least from that mid-scale perspective. So our next step was to transition from mid-scale to that treatment optimization scale. And we've been working with Vibrant Planet's land tender decision support tool. A big advantage for us is that it leverages many of the same processes used for the risk monitor, allowing for a smooth transition both internally and with partners. Now we're still in the early stages working with Vibrant Planet, but we're planning to use the tool for a lot of different things, but a couple that I'll highlight is to help us refine and spatialize our 5-year program of work on Forest Service ownership, to help us tell our risk reduction story through outcome-based performance metrics, and to work with partners to identify opportunities for multi-jurisdictional projects and establish a risk-based prioritization process for supporting private land treatment specifically. A final note that I'll share around planning is we worked with the Mission Area Senior Program Manager staff out of the Washington office to develop a program management plan. And I could spend a couple hours talking about this, but the PMP is like a roadmap that houses landscape processes, policies, and tools that we are leveraging to help execute on landscape program of work and navigate any issues that arise in the process. And we've seen a lot of value in that, and we're currently in the process of developing a similar structure for our All Lands partnership effort, working with the National Forest Foundation and partners. And with that, Sarah, I guess I'll pass it back to you to introduce our next speaker.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, John. Thanks for the shout out to the NFF work. We didn't plant that for John, but really appreciate hearing the value of that work there. So I'm gonna go ahead and introduce our next speakers. So Dana Gwynn is Southwest Partnership Manager with the Forest Stewards Guild, and Jeremy Marshall is the Rio Chama CFLRP Coordinator with the Forest Service. Dana and Jeremy, over to you.
All right, great. Good morning, everybody. Jeremy Marshall, Rio Chama Coordinator. Just want to give you guys kind of a context or big picture, landscape view of this. If you look at the map here, the bigger polygon is the 232 collaborative space, which is about 5 million acres. Our project is about 3.8 million acres. I jokingly say it's like 4 or 5, but complicated. 4 forests, 2 states, 2 regions, things like that. We've been really operating essentially as a collaborative space and a cohesive strategy using those dollars since 2016. Myself, I've worked in the landscape since 2017. I was the West Zone District Ranger on the Carson. Really it's just a very unique landscape in terms of from PJ to 14,000 foot alpine meadows, things like that. Really anti-government, especially in the northern New Mexico side of things, anti-authority. It's just a very unique landscape. Literally, there was a uprising in 1967, and I was a line officer in that country myself, and I seemed to, it's essentially come out unscathed. So really, we've looked at a lot of different approaches to modeling, and we'll get into this later. We looked at about 6 different ones. And a lot of these, we've just gone back and forth, and there's just a hard fit for their landscape. Half of it is non-Forest Service land. So we have a mixture of land grants and acequias, tribal nations, Hickory, Apache, various other things like that don't really fit into a model. And really water scarcity and water security is really our purpose and need of our project. I led the Southwest Hemas project for years, and a lot of them in the first cohort really kind of oversold the timber component of these. And so they really were chasing timber And we really made this one more decentralized by design, really, and set our targets to be reasonable across this landscape. And really are trying to focus on water security for the downstream users of Santa Fe and Albuquerque. So really, we have a complex and communal land management system in this area, and people are a little more apprehensive about models or things like that when we try to talk to our collaborative. Really, and we'll get into kind of where we've landed now, but we've gone back and forth for about the last 2 years looking at different models. We're essentially been kind of overwhelmed by them. As you guys know, there's a bunch of money in the system now, and there's various models out there, and we've essentially kind of landed on something that's more homegrown. I have a GIS data manager that works for the Forest Service, as well as the Guild has some talented folks, and we're really kind of thinking, that we'll kind of do essentially our own model. And doesn't mean that we won't reach out to other, practitioners and other models in the future. But currently where we're at, we're also, just for context as well, we're probably the least funded CFRP in the country per acre. That $3 million doesn't go too far with about 2 million acres of Forest Service land. So that's just kind of the context, and I'll defer to Dana to kind of dig in on some of our guiding values and kind of the why of how we've reached our decision.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jeremy. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the collaborative side. So Jeremy and I work really closely together. I work for the Forest Stewards Guild as a partner that leads the collaborative convening that is associated with the Rio Chama CFLRP, and that is the Two Watersheds, Three Rivers, Two States Cohesive Strategy Partnership. So, we started looking at, this is a huge landscape, and we started to think about how to both prioritize and optimize activities. And we've had a lot of discussion around what's the difference between prioritizing and optimizing, and how does one lead into the other. And ultimately, we're constantly trying to do a gut check of, can we talk about this with partners? Do the people that are closest to the potential outcomes of these actions and activities have access to these conversations? And how do we structure that appropriately? So ultimately, group decision making takes time, and you have to be really clear about what the parameters are, who's deciding what, and how you move forward. But we believe it's really the right thing to do in this context. When we're looking at different models and options for prioritization in this large landscape, we're also thinking about what's the value add. Like, if, implementing a landscape scale treatment plan and using tools, it supports the goals and objectives of both the 232 partnership and the Rio Chama CFLRP, especially in terms of cross-boundary planning and implementation and monitoring. And so we know those things to be true, and we want to make informed collaborative choices. But we also are trying to balance that based on the context that Jeremy talked about, with what information do we already have, and can we use relationships and common sense to be taking action now while we're also planning for the future in a flexible way, knowing full well that the folks that are in our shoes in 10 years or 20 years from now are going to bring their own biases to the table, their own perceptions, and want some flexibility. I think the other thing that really kind of runs true for us is that the commitments that we're making to collaborative dialogue and action around land management in this area are forever commitments, and we can't just do it one time and then move on. I think finally, we have an understanding that as much as we want to wrangle this stuff, collaborative processes are inherently messy and chaotic, and that they're iterative. And so we really want to look at tools that help us in those spaces while maximizing flexibility for ourselves and future land management planners and implementers. I think, overall, we want to be considering, if we're using models to justify actions that we already know, or if we're using them to uncover new and valuable information, and also whether or not they're not a means to an end in themselves. Like, we want them to open up space for hard conversations while building and preserving relationships in our landscapes. Given kind of the context that Jeremy talked about, it's hard to get things done, especially in like an area where there's distrust of the federal government and state government without really involving people from the start, even if it's hard. So I guess, Jeremy, if you want to talk about some of the tools that we've kind of worked on, and we're keeping in mind our time check as well. I can talk to one specifically, and then we can kind of move forward and tell you all where we are now.
Sure, go for it. Yeah. So, yeah, as far as the models we've looked at land tender, the risk assessment pods from SWRI we've looked at. We've also looked at the New Mexico and Colorado State Forest Action Plans. We have, those in our back pocket, if you will, and they also have a watershed component. We also looked at scenario investment planning as well. And probably the most one we've really took a deeper dive in was promote. And we really looked at that. And a lot of these models, we really kind of came to the conclusion on, as far as terms of care and feeding, internal staffing on who's going to maintain some of these data sets and things like that, as well as long term. There's a cost with these. And like I mentioned before, when you only get $3 million a year across this, if we spend a couple $100,000 on a model, that means, watershed's not going to get treated, or we're not going to be treating around the community. So those are some of the real trade-offs we had. And Dana came up with it. We jokingly came up with our, like the Johnny Cash song, one piece at a time, where he builds a car as, working in the auto plant, and, eventually has a different vehicle that's all his own. So, and I'll defer back to you, Dana.
Sure. And I know we have just a couple of minutes left. So I'll talk a little bit about in between 2019 and 2022, we did kind of one version of a homegrown model that we called the focal area model. We divided this large landscape into quarters roughly, and then had what we were calling sub-region leads, and they helped kind of convene groups of value holders and then communicate out to the larger group what primary values and resources and assets were in those areas. And while that was good, there was a lot of variation in the way that information came back together. It made it hard to kind of put together at a landscape scale. And then ultimately, that process ended in 2022 for a few reasons. There were some next steps identified, including exploring models and tools with sub-region leads. And if I'm being completely honest, we had some personnel turnover that played a big role in us kind of having to shift away from that process. And then there were also some challenges associated with usable data and information, a lack of consistency in funding, that it was partner-led, but because partners were experiencing turnover, I think a lot of times we discuss turnover from the agency side, but in this case, there was a lot of challenge associated with partner turnover that kind of stalled that process. Now with our Johnny Cash model, we can access some of the information that came out of it, which is nice, but it really didn't. In 2022, it kind of got stalled out, admittedly. Then we spent a long time working with Promote. And I don't know, Jeremy, if you want to talk about that, and then we probably have a minute left or so, and then we can tell you where we landed.
For sure. Yeah, we talked extensively with the Promote folks, and they certainly have a pretty impressive model. We were definitely going down that path, and we just had some concerns about just general longevity of it and cost long term. Currently we're all fairly flush with budgets, but we considered long term, as well as just in terms of how do we tell this story about this model to our partners. Like I mentioned before, there's some pretty rural communities, and if we tell people that a model is identified adjacent to them that we should treat, things like that, we really I think ultimately we had some internal bandwidth where we can control and manage the data of our own homegrown model, if you will, and using the pros and cons of each. But certainly we just decided that, I think, about 2 months ago, just to kind of move forward on that. And not to say it's going to be easy, but I think the collaborative and all of us, and we really kind of we kind of came down to whose decision is it? And to me, it's like, well, it's the entire collaborative. It's not a Forest Service decision. And I think there was just enough concerns that it wasn't a good fit for our project that we decided to go with an internal way to go. The only, the caveat to that is, since we have staff, if we didn't, I think we probably would have gone with promote. So.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. I mean, that's where we've ended up now, but it's open-ended, and we probably will need additionals and support, like tools and support over time. This is an iterative process, and this is where we landed for now. But it's very likely that we need to pivot again in the future. So, truly, I want to emphasize we've spent, many years looking at different models and options and ways to move forward. And sometimes there's a little bit of decision fatigue. Like there's a lot of options and opportunities, and just choosing something that we think is going to work for the landscape and helping people be informed and really keeping the door open for those ongoing conversations with the people that are going to be most affected by the work that we do is really kind of what we try to keep guiding us. So thanks for listening.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dana and Jeremy. So we're going to move on to our last landscape, and I want to just mention that if you have questions, you can go ahead and start putting those in the chat. Hopefully we can be a little bit interactive during our final Q&A and discussion, but would definitely help to start seeing some of those questions in the chat so we can preview those for our panelists. And in the meantime, I would like to introduce our final two speakers. Corinne Francis is the North Yuba Wildfire Crisis Strategy Coordinator with the Forest Service, and Dave Fournier is the Supervisory Natural Resources Manager with the Tahoe National Forest.
Thanks, Sarah. I think I'll just kick off and welcome everyone, and thanks for taking time to spend with us today. Our goal is to share some information about our North Yuba Forest Resilience Project with a focus on the tools and approaches that our North Yuba Forest Partnership used during the planning phase and now into the implementation portion of our project. Corinne's going to provide some background, and I'll sum up some of the challenges that we faced up along the way.
Okay, thank you, Dave. So I've been the landscape coordinator here since December. So really Dave is the brains of this operation. So our project area is the Yuba River watershed in Northern California. It's just northwest of Lake Tahoe. And the town of Downeyville is kind of in the center of this landscape, which is my background. So you can see how thick the landscape is. It's about 313,000 acres in size. It is one of the original 10 wildfire crisis strategy designations that was approved in 2022, just about right around the time it also became a CFLR landscape. At this time, they shared the same boundary, both WCS and CFLR, and Dave will share a little later about some of the challenges that we have with having two national forests within this landscape we're managing. So back in 2017, we launched a pilot effort in partnership through the Sierra Nevada Conservancy's Watershed Improvement Program. And that just brought some 9 entities together to work in partnership to collaboratively develop, finance, and implement the restoration. And it was formalized with an MOU defining the North Yuba Forest Partnership in 2019. There's a really good website that Jane's going to put in the chat so you can learn more about our partners in this effort. So hopefully you can take some time and take a look at our partnership. Another important aspect to our successes on the landscape was the fact that we started with a small pilot project that was about 15,000 acres in size up in the headwaters of the North Yuba watershed. And we started implementing back in 2019 with about $4 million of funding. So at this time, this was one of the first projects that launched NFF, National Forest Foundation, into implementation. And it was financed by the first ever forest resilience bond stood up by Blue Forest. The next project was larger in size, about 48,000 acres. also fund it from a forest resilience bond at about $25 million. So just same partners at a much larger scale. And we're going to put a link to Blue Forest in the chat so you guys can learn a little bit more about that innovative finance model that built that momentum early in the project lifetime. So as we built on this momentum, we went into a very innovative planning effort starting in October 2021. And then the record of decision from this final environmental impact statement was issued in June of 2023. So you can see that we're in the first year of this big implementation push. So this planning approach was pretty rigorous. We had to start with a baseline of processes and metrics to be used. So we considered the historic range of variability and integration of climate change trends into that information, and that established our desired conditions. We then set resilience goals and developed a method to assess treatment scenarios within those goals. It was kind of like an objective framework. We also used a lot of modeling of wildfire and drought in the planning, and assessing no action versus action, and keying in on both ecological benefits and fire risk reduction specifically. So another innovation was, surveying the partnership and other diverse entities to determine the weighted prioritization of these factors that I just touched on. Then we got to pilot the use of land tender with Vibrant Planet, and so that's already been talked about as a decision-making analysis tool. And we used it to assess where treatments would provide the greatest restorative return on investment, RROI, in protecting strategic areas, resources, and assets. So the acronym is SARA for the strategic areas, resources, and assets. So SARAs are these fuel breaks, critical access roads, there's structures such as residences, fire stations, utilities, reservoirs, and recreation sites. We definitely paid attention to cultural sites, both historic and prehistoric, with all the mining we've had in the landscape. And then we keyed in on some of the key, ecological types we had in the landscape, like mature forest, aspen groves, meadows, and T&E habitat in those SARAs. So, there's the process is lengthy. So if you want to learn more, there's really good videos that Vibrant Planet stood up to explain the land tender use in the North Yuba watershed, and that's going to be in the chat as well. So with all these inputs, we were able to prioritize the landscape into 9 sub-project areas, which is the map that you're seeing on your screen. So we went ahead and basically selected the proposed action in the FEIS across this whole landscape. But at the site-specific level, we did go ahead and issue about 27,000 acres of site-specific treatments that are starting to be implemented in sub-project number 1. We're still kind of prepping those areas. So this is going to be, this prioritization allows us to sequence RODs. And so the next ROD will be, record of decision will be on sub-project number 2, and we've already started that timeline for issuing the ROD in 2025. So kind of like that, keep moving on the planning and sequencing. So it was a great tool, land tender, for prioritization at the planning scale. But as we know, sometimes we have to pivot from a plan very quickly. So for example, our FY24 funding allocation came in at about 20% of the amount requested for sub-project number 1 implementation. So we dove right back into land tender to prioritize the remaining unfunded treatments and kind of pivot into that. So Dave's got a little bit of time to talk about some more of the challenges.
Great, thanks, Corinne. this may sound a little disjointed, but bear with me. There's a variety of things that we experience and hope to share and further learning here today. And I'd start off by just saying that whenever you start something for the first time, there's a learning curve. And I think having that patience and to work with your partners and even taking some risks to pilot, like we did, to pilot some tools and processes that have served us really well, and others now that we've seen in this presentation. We did experience some delays and challenges with that first landscape scale planning effort. And I'd say that one of the things as an agency we need to do a better job of is just dialing our scopes of work in better. And I think the more that we have partners doing work or contractors doing work in planning or prepping, even implementation, that's going to be a really important piece, is to focus on good, clear scopes of work. Well, to touch on a little bit of what Jessica brought up in her project life cycle slide, we did have a robust partnership, the North Yuba Forest Partnership, that worked great in the whole strategic side, that first step in the cycle. But then it was a little challenging because they wanted to also be a part of the NEPA side, which that's once we start in the scope of work or the scoping part of NEPA, that's where the Forest Service takes on that next step. And so it's just navigating and being clear where those lines in the sand are in our processes. Then one thing about the boundary, Corinne sort of set me up for this one. We did use the watershed, the whole watershed for this, and it included 84,000 acres on the Plumas, which at the time there was a brand new forest supervisor who wasn't 100% sure what he was getting into. So he let us take the lead on this landscape. But in that second round of Wildfire Crisis Strategy Landscapes, the Plumas got one, and that had a little bit of overlap. So we still share the exact same CFLR boundary, but on the Wildfire Crisis side, the Plumas and the Tahoe report those accomplishments separately. And within that landscape, we were very fortunate that we had existing NEPA, and our philosophy, I think, it's always important to have something in planning, prepping, and implementation all at the same time. So granted, a lot of times you have the same capacity doing all three, but that was important to us to spool that up. And then I think related to that, John's point about a culture shift, we looked at this not as a special project, but as a new way of doing business. That it's not just us doing our typical work on the forest. It's engaging with partners, and I think, I'm not sure if it was Jeremy made this comment. It's like we call this a collaborative, but we call it a partnership. So I think there's a little more investment by a partner as opposed to stakeholders who you do want involved and engaged in what you're doing to have that support. But the partnership was essential to actually getting work done on the ground. And so that's where NFF helped us out initially with our French Meadow project outside the landscape. And like I said at the beginning, it was a steep learning curve for the first time NFF actually doing implementation work, but it was prompted by Blue Forest Conservation and the Forest Resilience Bond, because the Forest Service, we couldn't utilize financing because the federal government can't pay interest. And so NFF agreed to be that partner who would accept that Forest Resilience Bond and implement the work, and being able to pay contractors right away for the work that they were doing was really key in the success of our project. So then it was a natural shift to take on much more implementation work on the North Yuba. And so we've been riding that wave ever since, and it's been a great partnership. Again, unprompted by Sarah, to plug the role that NFF has played with us and the rest of the partnership on this project. And I think I'll leave it there to allow some time for questions for all three of the landscape folks.
Great. Thank you so much, Dave and Corinne. I would love to open it up for a few questions, and I don't see any yet in the chat. So as our participants are thinking of some questions and getting those in the chat, I can start off with a couple. So if our other panelists could turn your cameras back on. So many good themes here. I think, let's see, which question should I go to first? So one theme that I'm hearing is that making decisions about forest management is inherently social when we're talking about multiple values that the Forest Service is trying to balance. And often there's clearly a desire to make those decisions in ways that are collaborative or involve meaningful public engagement. At the same time, many of these decision support tools or other prioritization tools can be really technical, can be really difficult for a layperson to parse, can be, you know, a long process to set them up in a way that accounts for the specific needs of that landscape. So just wondering if you can speak to how your landscapes are managing that tension between like a pretty highly technical tool and the desire for inclusivity. I think Dana and Jeremy spoke about this a little bit already, but just if any of the others want to comment on that, how your landscape has managed that, or if that has been a tension for you.
You know, one of the things that does come to mind for the North Yuba partnership that I think really helps us balance some of that out is we have a lot of subcommittees that work on different issues. And so you're bringing things down to a smaller level and kind of like finance, steering committee, implementation, monitoring, couple communications, so that there's not a big agenda and people are really, you know, dialing down into the actual strategic versus financial issues versus implementation issues. And that really helps. And the land tender, I think, was communicated well enough during the FEIS development that people seem to trust that model really well in the partnership. And so bringing back, like we did, the new run with the lack of funding, it seemed to go pretty good in communicating to those committees.
I guess I'll say we had a similar approach. We've established through our All Lands partnership a series of working groups and committees to address specific issues that pull in those partners or specialists from that organization or agency that have a keen interest or experience with that topic. One thing that the National Forest Foundation did for us early on was a series of assessment surveys with partners to establish how they wanted to engage, what kind of value they saw out of this effort, what they needed, to be engaged in this effort, and to be able to communicate that through their leadership or through their board or however their organization was set up. And through that process, we kind of determined that, we might have, for example, on the Forest Service side, we might have a Forest Service, someone in a leadership role on the steering committee, but in the different working groups, we might have an implementation forester that's serving on the implementation and strategic planning working group. We might have someone in GIS or that manages our data on our land tender and modeling and fire risk assessment group. We might have a public affairs specialist serving on the on our communications working group, and other agencies and organizations have kind of a similar structure. And we learned through that, like, for example, Idaho Power, they have a whole suite of communication that they're doing associated with wildfire mitigation that we really haven't been cross-pollinating and coordinating, and it's really opened the doors once we've started leveraging those strengths from all of our partners to kind of act as one unified group.
Sarah, can I add, I think for us, it's about like expectation management and like understanding what's reasonable to expect from applying a tool, and also what's reasonable to expect from the collaborative process with partners. Like, there's a lot of limitations, and I think a lot of times we go all in and think we're going to get a solution or an outcome that we're really hopeful for, when in reality, this stuff is really messy, and we want partners to have agency and input and understanding of the process. But ultimately, like, we as people are implementing the tool, and people that care about one another and about the landscape. And so, you know, again, I'll circle back to, like, how do applications of a model, you know, impact the people involved? And then, you know, the final thing I'll say as a partner to the U.S. Forest Service is that it's really important to continue to communicate consistently around the expenditure of social capital, especially that your partners have in the landscape. And every time you're asking value holders to come to the table and contribute information to a model, to be really clear that that's an ask of people to show up and engage with something. And so really asking yourself the question, like, is this worthwhile, and what are the outcomes? And communicating that clearly has been really important to us.
Thanks so much for that, all of you. There is one question in the chat. We have about 4 minutes left, so this will probably be our last one, and this was directed towards John Reiling, although others may have thoughts here as well. And the question was, I appreciated the intent of your landscape to prioritize treatments considering adjacent landowner concerns and building trust before addressing bigger risk reduction efforts. Can you speak to the perspectives with forest leadership about taking this approach?
Yeah, I mean, so we were really fortunate on the Boise and Payette National Forest to have strong leadership support. And I think a lot of this is just inherent with the Wildfire Crisis Strategy being such a high priority for the agency, that messaging is coming up and down the chain very clearly. And because of that, we've had support, and as well as some social license that I don't think we've had in the past. We're being asked to do a lot in terms of increasing pace and scale on USFS ownership, and to be quite honest, that is stressful, and it's really pushing a lot of our specialists to the limit. So the concept of, okay, and now I want you to look at, say, this project area or this fireshed container that only has 8% Forest Service ownership, and then it's this mix of all these other ownerships, and focus on some work in there, when that's going to, like, we might get 1 acre treated for the same price and time and effort that we could be treating 10 acres at the same time, right? But huge risk reduction for those efforts. And to our forest leadership's credit, they've made that a priority, while still keeping in mind, work-life balance for our employees, as well as we're not going to get away from targets associated with acres treated and volume sold. So we're still going to have to keep that in mind. So it's a balance, but I feel like we're finding a good process, really leveraging partners to help us with that cross-boundary piece.
Great. Well, thanks so much, John. I think we have to leave it there, but I want to give a huge thanks and shout out to all of our speakers, Jessica, John, Dave, Corrine, Dana. I think I'm missing somebody. Oh, Jeremy. We lost Jeremy. Oh, there, Jeremy's still there as well. Really, also to Lindsay and Rachel for starting us off. Really appreciate everyone being on today, and our participants for listening in and hopefully, getting something out of this webinar as well. Wanted to let you know that our next peer learning session will be Wednesday, April 24th. The Southwest Ecological Restoration Institutes, or SWRI, will be sharing the results of an assessment they've been conducting on collaborative governance. So really looking forward to that. Hope many of you can join us as well for that one. And the registration link is in the chat. And in the meantime, hope all of you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you again soon.